Every country in the world is now facing a problem with climate change.
Our oceans are warming, and they're warming fast.
Fueling extreme weather events.
The government issued its most dramatic report yet about climate
We're releasing
change.
more greenhouse gases than ever.
The high wind has the potential to damage houses, crops,
Welcome everyone to the new episode of Open Forum. My name is Alok Gupta. I work as a freelance environment journalist in Chicago. Today we are discussing imbalances resulting from the impacts of climate change. From severe droughts in Europe, US and China to devastating flood in Pakistan. The world is facing an unprecedented loss of lives, livelihood and resources due to these extreme weather events. In the coming years, the situation will only get worse. According to the World Health Organization, between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year. Most of these deaths will be from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. But such loss and devastation of life have particularly impacted developing countries as they have limited resources to rebuild their damaged infrastructure or pay enough compensation to recover from their losses. To discuss this issue, we have with us Harjeet Singh, Head Global Political Strategy, Climate Action Network International, Joydeep Gupta, South Asia Director, The Third Pole, a well-known media outlet that covers issues related to climate change. Andy Revkin, Founding Director, Initiative on Communication and Sustainability, Columbia Climate School. We also have a question and answer session at the end of the panel discussion. You can type your question in the comment box or use the speaker function. So let's begin our discussion with Harjeet. Harjeet, what's the scale of loss and damages caused by the climate change, and can developing countries afford the frequent costs of rebuilding damaged infrastructures and loss of livelihood?
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Alok, for that question. And I think it's really important for us to understand the scale of impacts that we are facing and how it's going to affect the economies and how it's going to cost. So there are various estimates, and of course, the way temperature continues to rise, it's very difficult to put a finger on one number. So there are different ranges available. So there are several analysis, and one of them indicates that there is going to be losses and damages to the tune of 290 to 580 billion dollars a year by 2030 in developing countries alone. And those estimates also, when they project towards 2050, the estimates are between 1 to 1.8 trillion US dollars in developing countries alone. And this does not include the cost of what we call non-economic losses and damages, which means that loss of life, loss of culture, loss of territory, amongst others. So the scale is absolutely massive, and as temperature increases, the cost of losses and damages is going to increase. And the challenge is that we right now do not have a system that can support countries who are facing these impacts uh, adequately. which means the current UN climate change system does not even have a stream of finance that supports countries recover from these impacts, what we saw in case of Pakistan.
1.8 trillion dollars by 2050 sounds like a lot of money. It seems that most of this problem can be solved by the funds if it is available, and also through adaptation and mitigation measures to combat climate change. Let me bring in Joydeep here. Joydeep, at Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, rich nations promised to pay $100 billion to developing countries so, so that they can adapt to climate change and rising temperature. So, is anything happening on that front?
I'm sorry to say the answer is no. Look, uh, right now at the last climate summit at Glasgow, the deadline to do that, to reach a financial support package of $100 billion a year as promised in 2009. The original deadline to keep that promise was 2020. That deadline's passed without that being kept. And at the last climate summit in Glasgow, the deadline was extended to 2023. And that deadline is now less than 2 months away. And I see absolutely no sign that that deadline is going to be met. So they are not, the developing countries are not getting the kind of financial support that they need to deal with climate impacts, which are already hitting them in such a big way in the form of floods, droughts, sea level rise, storms, lower agricultural output, you name it.
Right. So situation seems to be very critical. So this question to everyone in the panel. So will this issue likely to come up at COP27? And if this it will, if it is going to come up, what's going to happen? Any prediction on that?
Yes, Andy Revkin here. I've been writing about climate change since before there was a framework convention, since before this process all began in 1988. And I'm sad to say the Conference of the Parties, the COPs, are always playing catch up. I think these issues, there's two big divides, two big imbalances that will come up and could really derail things in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt later this year. One is this issue of money for adaptation, but the other is energy inequity. There's an energy imbalance in the world right now. The United States has a 16 ton per person per year CO2 output. India, I think, is up to 2, but there's a whole big portion of India that is probably a fraction of a ton per year. The low income families, hundreds of millions of people scattered more in rural areas, hardly have access to modern energy at all. And in Africa, there's a growing push by African nations that have fossil fuels, gas and oil particularly, to demand that the West not stand in the way of them developing those resources too, because they've never really contributed to global warming perceptibly, measurably, tiny emissions footprints. So it's actually a double challenge right now. The imbalances are both on energy access and equity and on this issue of vulnerability.
Right. Harjeet, you wanted to add something on this?
Yeah, so just also mention that I totally agree with Andy that COPs are catching up. And the reason we have not been able to get any ambitious outcome commensurate to the scale at which we need these actions, because the COP process that works on consensus, and rich countries who technically have the same power as a smaller country or economically weaker country, but politically, because they have a lot of clout, they are able to influence the negotiations the way they suit, and they also have a lot more resources in terms of the delegation they bring in and the power they assert. And because of that, we have not been able to make progress. However, we have reached a point where what we saw in Pakistan is happening all over the world, and particularly poor communities are suffering, and that's why they have put pressure alongside civil society to make sure that this particular COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh this November, delivers on the issue of loss and damage, which means that communities who are facing these climate impacts need to be supported through a global system, which right now exists in the form of humanitarian aid, which is a voluntary system. But what we need under the UN climate change is a system that's based on obligation. So this COP27 is going to be absolutely crucial in delivering on that outcome to make sure that people who are suffering get support from this international system.
Right, Harjeet makes a very strong point here that it's the poor communities that are most at risk because of the climate change. Andy, can you explain to our audience that who's and which groups are losing their livelihood because of the climate change? And do developed countries have a better mechanism for compensating such loss and damages?
Let's just talk about one sector, agriculture, just as a way to start. Clearly, there's a long history in countries like the United States of developing crop insurance. You know, it's a financial buffer to losses if you have a particularly bad season and you're a farmer growing soybeans or some other crop that has a bad year. Finding a way, that's something that's, again, in poorer regions, sub-Saharan Africa, there are models that are expanding to help farmers develop financial resilience, but they're way behind and underfunded. It's just, so that's one example of just a small one of how this plays out. The other sectors are, well, also in agriculture, the agricultural workers aren't very well protected in the United States either from extreme heat. You know, who is working outside in adverse conditions, extreme conditions? It's usually low-income people, and that's true everywhere. So the United States is just starting to right now develop the Labor Department under the Biden administration is just now putting in standards for heat exposure as a occupational risk that weren't even there here. So the world is really still trying to grapple with some of these realities as particularly heat get in the way of productivity.
Right, but when we take into consideration the scale of devastation that has happened in Pakistan, with a third of the country drowned, and the farmers and the agriculture sectors suffering to such a large extent, Jaydeep, do you think, as Andy points out, the concept of crop insurance, do you think it's working in India? Because India is facing frequent crop failures.
Very, very partially is my answer. It's now been around for some time. And of course, it had a major setback due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I have not heard of any major insurance payout since the end of the pandemic. Although this year, both the winter crop and the summer crop are in trouble. The winter crop is already, in large swaths of India, the winter crop is already down by about a quarter due to a very, very early heat wave. Again, a direct impact of climate change. A heat wave that started in March when it's supposed to be spring. And right now, India is faced with a situation where it may lose around 5% of its summer rice production. And that is going to impact the global market. India is the world's largest exporter of rice. And again, this is due to a very, very uncertain South Asian monsoon, which has left large swaths of the Ganges Valley in drought, while causing floods just to the south of that. The same system of monsoon winds that created the latest round of floods in Pakistan also created floods just to the south of the Ganges Valley in India. So, yes, we are faced with multiple whammies now, and to the extent to which crop insurance is working in that is very small. I have done reports on this from Marathwada in Maharashtra just before the pandemic, and I have repeatedly found that farmers have been asking, putting in their claims and waiting and waiting and waiting. There is one point I would like to add there, that even in the best case scenario, where farmers get their crop insurance, it is almost inconceivable that the landless agricultural laborers will get any money out of that. Given that a crop failure means real hunger for the landless agricultural labor in developing countries.
That's quite a contrast that we are seeing. While US is paying compensation for heat stress, India is unable to pay its farmer for crop loss. To give our audience the scale of imbalance caused by climate change, a Stanford study measured the economic gap between the richest and the poor nations in terms of per capita income, which is now 25% larger than it would have been without climate change. So that it is like quarter of the income is lost in the developing countries because of climate change. Let's move our discussion to understand how rising impact of climate change is affecting women more than men. Does it mean they face more livelihood loss? Anyone from the panelists want to pitch in on this? Andy? Yes, Andy, go ahead.
Sorry, I muted myself. In countries like Kenya, women are a substantial portion of those who are farming. They control the money. Their lives and livelihoods are very much affected by stresses on agricultural output. In other regions, there's actually been some studies about domestic violence increasing when there's extreme heat. There's a couple of researchers at Columbia University who've been looking at that relationship. So obviously that would tend to impact women more. I'm sorry, in this discussion we couldn't find the organizers couldn't find a female panelist who working in that kind of area, but those are things that I've come across.
Right. Andy, Harjit, you want to weigh in on the issue of gender, the women facing a much more impact of climate change?
Sure. I mean, it's absolutely clear because of the societal roles women play and also the kind of resources they have access to. For example, if you look at the data, men own 50% more wealth than women globally. So, which means there's a clear resource gap. And when it comes to the kind of societal roles women play at home, the household chores, those activities are directly impacted by climate change, which means they spend more time fetching water, firewood, and taking care of cattle. If there is a heat phenomenon, then people who get sick, then they spend more time in taking care of family members, which means that the care responsibility is much more with women. So they are disproportionately affected by these impacts. So we have to look at the role of women in the society and how they do not have access to sufficient resources. At the same time, they feel they have more responsibility to respond to the climate impacts.
Right. Very deplorable condition there. Hope something is done on that front. Apart from economic and gender imbalance, there is another imbalance that is rarely talked about when it comes to climate change. That is the knowledge gap. Are there enough research facilities in global south or in developing countries to help the region tackle their emissions that causes climate change, impacts of climate change, and livelihood loss that results from it? Andy, can you please explain how this knowledge gap is affecting the global fight against climate change,
Oh,
especially in the developing countries?
oh, sure. In 2007, when I was still at the New York Times, I was the lead writer on a series, on a report called "The Climate Divide," and one of my colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa reported on Malawi. From Malawi, their national meteorological budget was $150,000. The United States has a multi-billion-dollar, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Weather Service. Africa generally across the continent still has basic monitoring of climate conditions. You can only do so much from a satellite. There's a guy named Mickey Glantz who worked for decades to try to build for the West to help fund a meteorological training and program for Africa, and that's still, mostly a dream. And that's just one example. So that basic capacity to understand what's happening with climate is still constrained. Making that information actionable on the ground is another step. And there's been a lot of progress. Bangladesh, the meteorological community there has worked really hard using social media and other means to get alerts about cyclones to communities, and you've seen great progress in cutting deaths and injury from cyclones compared to what was the norm 30 or 40 years ago. So it's an uneven landscape there, but generally, and by the way, I think the IPCC, in how it's tried to incorporate, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has tried to incorporate more a diversity of authorship, and that community learns and works from itself. So the more that developing country scientists are become leadership in the IPCC process, that better informs the treaty process and all of us.
Right. There's clearly an infrastructural gap in understanding the weather system in the global south or in developing countries. Joydeep, you are an editor and you deal with a lot of stories and reporters from developing countries, especially in Asia. Do you feel the pinch of not getting enough knowledge or enough quotes or statements from the scientific community uh, in developing countries, and how do you deal with it?
Well, as Andy pointed out, it's very uneven. Even in the global south or the developing world, whatever you want to call it, it is uneven. Scientists in countries such as Brazil, South Africa, India, Mexico, Indonesia, they are of world standards, they are global standards. They work with their counterparts in the developed world all the time. And these journalists in these countries usually don't have a problem. But then there are many countries in my neighborhood. I can think of Nepal, I can think of Bhutan. In other parts of the world, I can easily think of many sub-Saharan African countries, many of the smaller Latin American countries, many countries in the Pacific, where scientific research is way behind where it should be. So, as a result, the voices of those scientists do not always get into the global debate, the global discussion to the extent it should, simply because not enough research is going on there.
Harjeet, do you want to add anything on this issue?
Sure. I would like us to look at the whole issue of knowledge gap or technology gap from the perspective of historical injustice and colonialism. When we talk about developing countries, or some would call it third world, which I would not agree to. So how for centuries the traditional knowledge systems have been systematically demolished, and how rich countries are controlling resources. So the new technologies that have been developed, those are not being transferred, which means for developing countries to access these technologies, the opportunities are very limited, and they do not have resources. So they, being a developing country, their immediate priorities are about investing in education, health, and infrastructure, than investing into some kind of institutions which are not of an immediate need. And when we talk about climate, this is where rich countries had the luxury of resources to invest into new in the development of these technology and more research. So where we are at this moment, rich countries are blocking those resources. They did not allow the technological discussion to progress at the UN level. Basically, they want to control all the knowledge and resources. So, on one hand, colonialism led to destruction of the traditional knowledge systems, and the new technologies are not being transferred. So, we need to look at this issue from the perspective of historical injustice and how that has led to making many communities and countries more vulnerable to climate impacts.
That's very insightful. And we all agree that climate change is creating quite a bit of imbalances on many fronts. Is there a solution or solutions, or it is too late to balance these imbalances? Uh, Andy, you want to take this question?
Sure. This is a question that comes up a lot, the too late question. Whether or not there are tipping points out there, we all somehow have to find a way to get comfortable with the reality that, as has just been articulated about in talking about historical injustice, these are long trajectories that led to these deeply entrenched divides and problems, and it's a long path ahead. There's no sudden revolution that's going to make the world magically decarbonize and magically boost all the reduce vulnerability for those at greatest risk. It's I'd like to think that if Greta Thunberg and Al Gore, ran the world, things would suddenly change. It just doesn't work that way. So I talk about the need to combine a sense of urgency with patience. Those words don't seem to really work too well together, but when you have a systemic problem, it takes a long time to unravel. That's the bad news. The good news is when you have a deeply entrenched, multidimensional problem, everyone can contribute. We think of global warming, and it's changing the global climate, but local vulnerabilities are something that every community, from the poor part of town in Portland, Oregon, where it was homeless people who died in the heat wave, to Germany, bless them, Germany, where they had this flash flood. And 11 of the deaths were in a home for disabled people where no one had adequate way to get out, to so many instances I've reported on in poorer countries where these, like in Durban recently, the flash flood, it's not the rich communities that got nailed by that. It's people who had no place to live except in floodplains. So there's tons to do at the local level in all these instances you can reduce vulnerability right now. Heating, cooling centers, heat for when it's too hot, heating centers for when it's too cold. And that's still a big issue, whether it's in Pakistan or in Minnesota. Those are things that we can all work on at every scale.
Great. That's very insightful, Andy. Thank you very much. Now we are almost halfway through our session, and now it's time to begin our question and answer session. And our first question is from Kusbu, who has asked on Facebook, what happens if the world, sorry, the, her question is, if all of Earth ice melts and flows into the ocean, what would happen to the planet rotation?
I could speak to that. There's already some studies underway that show that it's pretty basic physics. If there's a big mass of ice at the top and bottom ends of the world, and that gets redistributed, you do end up changing some of the basic planetary dynamics. It's not, to me, in the arena of things we need to worry about, because the time scale on that melting is very long. You look at the videos of Antarctica losing an iceberg, it seems dramatic. But I've been to Greenland, the giant ice cap in the Arctic, and it will take centuries and centuries, actually millennia, for that ice to flow into the ocean. So it feels dramatic sometimes now, but these are long-term processes.
Right, but this melting will have a very devastating impact on climate change and on
Sea level. Yeah, sea level. Yeah, I would worry more about sea level rise than about rotation change.
Right. Question number 2 is from Shweta, who asks, what happens if the world heats up more drastically, say 4 degrees Celsius, when the Paris Climate Agreement has sets the limit as 1.5 degrees Celsius? Now, anyone want to take this question?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. The IPCC, which Andy referred to, has said in the past that what will happen after a 3-degree heat, overall heat rise, is something that they find extremely difficult to model. And that means basically that we are in uncharted territory. We are in territory where changes are happening and are projected to happen in discrete jumps, not gradually, not in a smooth manner. And that is what is extremely worrying. The Paris Agreement said that all the countries would pledge to keep global warming, average warming, within 2 degrees Celsius, and would strive to keep it within 1.5. Right now, there is no sign that the activities of the governments will keep it anywhere below an average rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So we are seriously talking about bad case scenario, 4 degrees Celsius rise. And the simple answer to that is that it is so frightening that scientists are unable to model it.
That's a very, I say, very serious scenario that you are talking about. So, anyone else want to join in? Harjeet, do you want to add something on this?
I would say that we are right now living in a 1.2 degree warmer world, and just look around what's going on. And I keep giving this example. During lunchtime, I get to watch television for those 10-15 minutes, and I scroll 3 channels: BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNN. For the last several weeks, there's not been a single day when I haven't seen the issues of disasters and climate change. And as IPCC had predicted long ago, that extreme weather events are going to be the new normal. We have already landed in that situation. It's 1.2 degree. And if we talk about 4 degrees, as Joydeep very rightly said, it's unimaginable. I don't know what kind of modeling we can do, because it doesn't work on a simple multiplication factor that 4 degree is going to be 4 times more impact than 1 degree. it's going to be absolutely devastating, because we are going to see the collapse of the climate system that has kept this planet the way it is for millions of years or thousands of years. Look at where we are at 1.2 degree. So it's going to be absolutely dramatic, unimaginable, and we need to brace for it, prepare for it, and that's how the discussions on loss and damage have become extremely important, because we have to respond to the impacts right now while we have to prepare for those impacts. That's what we call adaptation. But at the same time, continue to strive to stay below 1.5 degree. All three actions are now equally important.
And we are seeing that impact already. Yesterday, it rained in Chicago and it flooded. The same thing is something that Bangalore is experiencing. A bit of rain and the entire city comes to a standstill. Let's go to question number 3. This question is from Frank, and the question is: if we want to have a livable planet for some, which seems to be what some politicians are thinking, then the window of opportunity might be bigger. But then we are making a conscious decision to sacrifice people. Harjeet, you want to answer this?
Sure, Alok, and that connects to my previous response. And we have been talking about Paris Agreement and the target of 1.5 degree, which politicians strive to, but the target which is more agreed is the 2 degree target. But what's the reality? I would again bring us back to where we are. At 1 degree temperature rise, we already decided that we are sacrificing people. Not just in this part of the world, where we live. We have, again, example from Pakistan is horrifying. But what's happening in the small island states, where one incidence of disaster can just wipe their economies and ecosystem. In 2017, there was Hurricane Maria in Dominica. It actually wiped off its entire yearly GDP. In fact, the impact was 226% of their GDP. One incidence in Dominica. So that's the kind of impact, and I'm talking of something that happened 5 years ago. So this target of 1.5 or 2 is not a scientific target. It's a political target. It's something that developed countries felt convenient about, and that's how the terminology of national circumstances or nationally determined contribution has been at play than top-down targets, which were actually needed based on equity, justice, and fairness, that who has caused the problem in the first place, who should be taking more targets, and let's divide the cake of responsibility accordingly, and not what your national circumstances. Imagine if rich countries talk about national circumstances, what about developing countries? Look at the current reality. When Europe had a threat that their energy will not be secure, they are ready to go around the whole world and do the digging and drilling because they want to be secure. And when India, several years ago was saying that we have 200 million people who don't have access to electricity, we need some more ecological space and give us technology, nobody paid attention. So, the problem is that some rich countries and rich corporations are the ones who have done backseat driving to drive us to a place where it's only disasters are all around, and we have allowed them to drive us, and that has to change if we still want to redeem some of the damage that we are going to see if we don't act now.
Thanks, Harjeet, for explaining this question in such detail. Now let's go to a video question that has been asked by Frank.
My name is Frank Ross. I'm a trustee of Environmental Protection Scotland, a charity designed to support environmental protection here in Scotland. My question is following on from COP26 in Glasgow, where many of the great aims of environmental and climate change were reaffirmed, including the financing to the underdeveloped countries of $1 billion per year. We had a real opportunity with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where normal fossil fuel supply chains were disrupted significantly. And we had a real opportunity to reset our economies based on these COP26 commitments. But we've taken the opposite view, and we've recommenced and reopened fossil fuel coal power stations. We're restoring gas at a rate that we've never stored it in Europe before. So is COP26 and its aims a reality? Are these going to be delivered? Is there still hope that we can actually take action?
Joydeep, Frank question is very pertinent, keeping in view COP26 is coming up and not many governments are ready to fulfill their promise. So you want to answer, please?
Okay. Frank actually raises a very, very important point that the slightest sign of the status quo being disturbed, and we keep going back to a sort of retreat into fossil fuel situations, which is what we are seeing in Europe right now. And so that is extremely worrying, of course. His bigger point and his bigger question is, where does this kind of backsliding, this constant backsliding, leave the entire COP and the UN climate negotiations process? And that's the point there, is that does it actually do something? I have covered every climate summit, the COP, since 2007, and I have always felt that a COP is maybe 1.5 steps forward and 1 step back. So you ultimately end up moving just a little bit more. The real substantial work has to be done by countries. And the best we can hope for from a system that depends on consensus from every government in the world is that it will not take us backward.
Andy, I think you also want to respond to this.
Yeah, in 2005, at the Montreal COP, I was there when Tony Blair, the Prime Minister from the UK, said no country will sacrifice its economy for the sake of this problem. That's 2005, and there's been echoes of that selfishness ever since. I think the energy crisis generated by Putin's invasion of Ukraine is going to temporarily, yes, it's going to sustain gas, particularly as a key fossil fuel going forward, and oil too. I think coal is still essentially on the way out. These trajectories are longer than those of us concerned about climate change who would like them to be. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that the jolt to Europe, particularly, is going to make Europe switch away from its dependency on gas more and more. And I think it's revealing the paths forward that have to happen if you really want a world with a sustainable energy system that isn't vulnerable to shocks like this. Having just sustainable access to energy is a key, but it's going to be as Ashok said, it's going to be a sort of herky-jerky, constant tension, and that's why the work is vital here, elevating the voices of those countries and populations that have inadequate energy even now, understanding, making the West understand if it's going to demand a post-carbon future, that it has to help financially in a big way countries that need more energy. That has to happen too. And as we all know, that has not happened in the last 10 years through the mechanisms under the treaty. I think one of the things I'm hoping will start to be revealed is that it's in rich countries' self-interest to foster resilience and security in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. That it's not just a justice issue or an empathy issue. You could be really sort of selfish and know that if you want to have instability in places like Somalia and Ethiopia right now, then don't invest there. If you want to have instability, if you want to have stability, foster advancement, sustainable advancement. So it takes daily work. None of this is like, everyone thinks about there's a magical COP that's going to happen. COP 29, COP 30. Forget about that. Okay, this is a long journey. It took a century to get fossilized. It'll take decades for us to chart a path, and we can reduce vulnerability now in big ways everywhere.
Right. Harjeet, do you want to add something to it?
Sure. Circling back to things that I said earlier, I think we need to recognize that there are several structural problems with the way United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change works. One, it's based on consensus, which means what you get is the lowest common denominator. As Joydeep was saying, we make progress, but the progress is so fragile that because of other interests, then we see that backtracking and backsliding happening. And that's why, though, that terminology of national circumstances. So we have not looked at the global problem from a global perspective. If you look at a global problem from your own national self-interest perspective, you will never be able to solve the problem. And that's what happened in the last 30 years. Second, we allowed the interest of fossil fuel industry to thrive, not just survive, but thrive in this space. So the Paris Agreement does not even mention coal, oil, and gas. Can you imagine? So we have talked about mitigation, but we have not talked about the supply side of the problem, which has caused the problem in the first place. Even now, with all the renewable energy hullabaloo, 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuel. And where European countries are going back to? Fossil fuels, because they did not invest sufficiently in renewable energy. So in the wake of crisis, the dependence on fossil fuel is much more. And COP26 had the biggest delegation from whom? Fossil fuel industry, and not bigger than any government in the world. And what you got at COP26 was only mention of coal, and that too, weak language on unabated coal and insufficient subsidies, no mention of oil and gas. So basically, what you need is an agreement that is supplementary to Paris Agreement. We need a treaty, a fossil fuel treaty that actually looks at the whole cake and then cuts it based on fair share and supports countries in phasing out. There are some who are dependent. So we have to have a global mechanism in place to phase out fossil fuels. Otherwise, we are going to be stuck in the system for a very long time, and it's going to bring that doomsday scenario even earlier.
That's a very interesting point, that we need a pact only on fossil fuel. So let's now move to next question.
Hello,
and it's a video.
I'm Dolly Rani Nayak. I work at the University of Aberdeen. I have been working on the topic of agriculture and climate change for last 20 years, you can tell. And I wanted to ask the panel, so when managing the climate change, it is really decision making. For example, I just wanted to ask, we know that livestock is a big sector contributing to the climate change, but should we get rid of all the livestock, or we should manage it better, manage the manure better, so that we can mitigate the impact of climate change. So decision making and how it is impacting the small farmers, how we can do this in a way that we can mitigate climate change. At the same time, we can help the small farm holders to grow crops or animals in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Emission from the agriculture sector and livestock. Joydeep, you want to answer this?
It's a fairly specific question on methane emissions from livestock, I see. So there are two parts to methane emissions from livestock. One part is the methane emissions due to the feed that the livestock eat. The other part is due to the dung. So the solutions are also different. The solution in terms of what the feedstock for the livestock is the scientists tell us to change it and to change to the kind of feed that causes less methane emissions. The problem with that is that so far all the substitute feed available is significantly more expensive. So I do not understand how we can expect a smallholder dairy farmer or a shepherd to be able to afford to do this unless we have a very strong system going. That's one part of it. The other part of it is the use of dung is entirely possible. Dung is actually used extremely inefficiently throughout the developing world, and using it in biogas is a far better way of using it than it's being used right now in a vast majority of cases. So there is a very strong case for pushing biogas in rural economies.
Right. That sounds like a fair solution, Jyoti. Harjeet, do you want to add something to this?
Well, the only big question is that how do we differentiate between the emissions coming from the industrial sectors and smallholder farmers? And that has to be investigated thoroughly, and we need to be looking at them separately, because there are also studies that say small farmers are cooling the world, especially the kind of integrated system they have. As Jyoti was saying, if the dung is being used for biogas and they have an integrated farming system, small farmers are the solution to this crisis. The problem is with the industrial sector, be it the industrial agriculture generally and livestock in particular. So I think that is where the problem is, and there's also a lot of confusion being caused by industries, so that the onus is more on small farmers than them, who will find it hard to change their whole model and the economic system.
Right. Let's go to next question. This is from Manisha, and who asked, is the climate change and the damage that is caused by it, are they reversible? Could we reverse that damage? Andy?
Well, I think we have to presume the answer is yes. Of course, as we said earlier, tipping points in the system, for example, not just tipping points, but seas will be rising for centuries to come, if not millennia already. It's just a matter of the rate, reducing the rate by cutting emissions and stopping warming. That doesn't change the reality of sea level rise. What can change is how we shape our relationship with coastlines. There's every kind of innovation and idea is out there, from floating cities to certainly to thinking about giving more space to nature, whether it's along river flood plains or coastlines, mangroves and on coastlines. And there's what's called green infrastructure. If you can move back from rivers, give them more space. One of the key issues in Pakistan, sadly, is it's the Indus River. That whole area is a giant floodable basin, a big portion of it, and now there are 230 million people living, not all of them, but living in that area. So reinventing Pakistan for a 21st century, even with past flooding history, and looking ahead for sure with future, you're going to have to come up. There'll have to be fundamentally new relationships with nature. If you give nature a chance, and I saw this in the Amazon rainforest when I was writing a book about the murder of Chico Mendes there a long time ago. There are many areas where the former ranch land grows back, and it's called capoeira. Over time, it will become a new forest. I have no concerns about nature's capacity to thrive after this jolt. More concerns about our own capacity and making sure it's equitably distributed to do the same.
Right. We have another question, one more video question to go.
Hello, my name is Jagdish Yaluripati. I'm a senior scientist in James Hawking Institute. I would like to ask the panel the question. Many of these climate impacts already we know, and there is a very good scientific consensus how this trajectory is going to take in the next few years. And we are very soon reaching to a point of no return. Even we make actions that may not have any impact on future if you don't make the right moves now. But what I see is the lack of consensus across the board. Even in the COP26, we have seen in the last minute changes in the documents. So what are your expectations from the panel? I would like to ask how much extent consensus will be built in COP27, so that we can seriously take these things forward and protect the next generations. Thank you very much.
Anyone from the panel who wants to take this question?
Okay, I'll start, and then I'm sure others will want to chip in. Basically, the way the situation is right now is that unless there is a huge push from the civil society and the media on the reality of climate impacts, we will continue to get business as usual in the COP situation, and that's not going to be helpful. So, yes, change. I continue to be an optimist in that sense that change is possible, but change needs a huge push, both from civil society and from media globally.
Harjeet?
Well, I totally agree with what Joydeep said. Our political leaders are in, most of them, if not all, are in bed with rich corporations, and they are only representing their interest. And we have seen that happening over the last few decades, particularly from the rich world. And the situation in developing countries is also quite similar. So we have to make sure, as Joydeep said, as civil society, as media, to hold our leaders to account, both in the developing and developed world, to make sure that they understand the urgency. And somehow climate impacts, unfortunately, provide us that opportunity where we talk about what's happening in the real world and what needs to change. So far we have had that impression that we will be able to avert the crisis, but look at where we have landed 30 years after we got the convention. And now we have to reverse the argument and say we have to protect the people who are suffering from the impacts now. So we have to help them, and then of course look at the bigger problem of what is causing the climate crisis. So by putting people at the center and talking about climate impacts, we are not only talking about addressing loss and damage now, we are talking about doing that in the long term, which means also working equally on adaptation and mitigation issues, and particularly targeting the fossil fuel industry.
Anyone else wants to answer this, or should I move to another question?
Well, we could move to the end, but I just would reinforce that the world has never had more capacity for civil society to make a difference. In fact, the media, thankfully, we have Ashok's the Earth Journalism Network. Many media around the world are focused on climate. Don't rely on that to be the driver of change. Community direct engagement with leaders, not just in the streets, but through pressure, through identifying radically, meaning getting to the root of what's driving vulnerability on the ground, can create difference. In other words, housing, the lack of safe housing is a big chunk of what we call climate vulnerability. People are living in floodplains for a reason, because whether it's in Tacloban in the Philippines, where hurricane or typhoon Haiyan hit, or elsewhere, if people coming into cities are not housed safely, then you'll have continuing disasters. And that's stuff that communities can really, from the ground up, push for change on. The same thing with energy. I've seen examples encouraging around the world. So the last thing is, I think if I had one message to everyone watching, it's think. Oh, sorry. I used to think of the COP process as shaping outcomes. We sit and wait for dramatic decisions. I now have become convinced that this process is basically integrating what's being done on the ground in different countries around the world. So start on the ground, and the cops will have better outcomes. Without that, it'll be more of the same. Sorry about my signal.
That's fine. We have another question from Kruti, who's asking, what are the small changes that we can make to our lifestyles to help better the climate change? Anyone wants to take this question?
Well, I just very briefly, because I already spoke.
Mhm.
I'll say, look around your neighborhood and look to see who's vulnerable. In the United States, there are poor families who have air conditioning but can't afford to run it because it costs too much electricity. In areas around the world, there's always someone in harm's way whose life can be improved by community engagement. In heat waves, in flooding, that's something to work on everywhere.
Right. Thank you, Andy. One common question for all the panelists: how hopeful we are about achieving the climate goal?
Okay, what's the climate goal? That's the big question.
Yeah.
If the climate goal is the Paris official goal of keeping global average warming within 2 degrees Celsius, preferably within 1.5, then I don't think that's going to happen. What is quite likely to happen is that we are going to overshoot that, and then the impacts are going to be so horrendous that we will be forced to cut back, and then slowly the system will reassert itself and rebalance itself. In the process, millions of people will suffer.
Right. Harjeet?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, that's where we are heading because of the interest of big companies and rich countries. That's the kind of development model we have set. But what makes me hopeful is the power of civil society and media to hold countries and corporations to account. And I would also connect that with the previous question on lifestyle. Of course, we all have to do what we can do in terms of what kind of food we eat and transport we use and plastic and garments and so on. But I must tell you one thing which we should definitely do as a citizen is holding our politicians to account. That right now is much bigger than what we can do individually, which we should do anyway. But the bigger task is holding our leaders to account and asking them what policy decisions they are taking now in countries locally, and also what they are doing globally, because we are dealing with a global problem that is impacting us locally. So I think that connection needs to be made, and that's where the role of citizens, civil society, and media are extremely important.
Andy?
Yeah, well, just I agree. And to me, I'm a journalist and a communicator. I run these webcasts through that link down in my ID there. And what I see every day is if you have something to contribute, whether you're an engineer or a teacher or an artist or an activist, sharing the experience, both the negative and positive learning, is a key way to amplify and spread those capacities that Harjeet and everyone here was talking about, including pressure on leaders. It's one thing to write a letter or to stand in the street, but it's another to push that through social media or other means to widen the view. And that's what gives me hope. There's so much potential for creativity, empathy, community action that I think we'll find a way through. It won't be the world we grew up with, any of us, and it will have losses, many of which can be mitigated again right now. But there's a prospect of building what I think of as a better relationship between humans and the climate system. Part of that's through cutting emissions, part of that's through cutting vulnerability, and both of those are equal imperatives. And if we all focus as much as we can on that across different sectors, there's every reason to think we'll come out with a better relationship with the climate system and with energy going forward.
So with this hope, but with the warning that a lot more needs to be done, we wrap up this session. And I would like to thank the Open Forum for organizing this session. I would also like to thank our panelists, Harjeet, Joydeep, and Andy. And also, I would also like to thank our tech support, Gaurav and Soumya in the background, for smoothly handling this session. Thank you very much. We will see you next time at the Open Forum. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
This is great. Very useful.